right, I think I'll get started. Welcome everyone to the Sustainable Development Goal webinar series. This is our last webinar of the year, of the academic year. We will be starting a new series in the fall, so we hope to welcome you to that series after we have a welcome break over the summer. So today's webinar is focused on SDG number 1, actually, no poverty. And we're going to have 3 speakers who will be introduced as they speak today, who are looking at poverty from a few different lenses. So we look forward to hearing from them and how poverty relates to SDGs in their work and career. Next slide, please. So just some ground rules, if you will. If you do have questions, this is in a webinar format. So if you have questions, if you could please put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little box to click there. And we will answer them as we receive them and also at the end during question and answer. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, so you can look for that later. If you do have issues with Zoom, if you could please contact the Zoom Help Center. I'm going to start. My name is Katie Pelican. I am the co-lead for the Sustainable Development Goal Initiative with Karen Brown, who you'll be hearing from later. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our initiative here at the University of Minnesota, and then Karen will be moderating the panel discussion. So our Sustainable Development Goal Initiative is under the GPS Alliance, which is our international office. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, these are 17 goals laid out by the global community under the United Nations that really integrate human development, what was the Millennium Development Goals, with environmental sustainability, what was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And so they're meant to be an integrative suite of goals to develop human society at the same time as maintaining the natural resources of our Earth. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Development Goal Initiative is really aims to foster programs broadly around these goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. And we do that in a variety of ways. We are contributing to a number of global frameworks, and this is as an institution. So we belong to the Sustainable Development Goal Solutions Network. We have signed the University Global Compact, and associated with that have some metrics that we fulfill. And then we also, this year, are contributing to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which are based on the Sustainable Development Goals with the goals Zero Hunger, Good Health and Wellbeing, Climate Action, and Partnerships for the Goals. And these are actually embedded into our strategic plan across the whole university now. So we're supporting some of that work. Next slide, please. We have a few approaches, if you will, or work that we do. One is to support some of that documentation of impact. So we support, we're supporting a metrics team that's contributing to the Times Higher Ed work, as well as the Global Compact work. And we are also doing a lot of mapping of work, both coursework and research against the Sustainable Development Goals to better understand kind of where our institution sits. Next slide, please. We also are fostering interdisciplinary work in a variety of ways tied to those metrics that I talked about, the Times Higher Ed metrics, both this year and next year. We're developing a number of, or supporting a number of SDG innovation teams that also tie to our strategic plan at the university. And the topics are listed there. So we're hoping to, through those, foster interdisciplinary teams that cut across faculty and staff and students across the university to stimulate interdisciplinary work and solutions. We also run a couple of grants programs. One is the Rapid Response Grants. Those were awarded in the fall, and we're in the middle of reviewing a suite of research grants. And we also are fostering new partnerships, most notably the Aurora Network, which is a European-based network, university network, focused on sustainable development goals. And in fact, our president here at the university just spoke at their biannual meeting. So a relationship at high levels of the university. Next slide, please. We also have what we call toolkits. So these webinars are part of that. We host funding collisions where appropriate. We work with the libraries to look for experts who at the university who fit the different sustainable development goals. And we're also developing kind of a suite of tools that can be useful, including one on systems mapping. So that's sort of a brief introduction to our program. And with that, I'm going to turn the reins over to Karen Brown, my co-lead.
Thank you very much, Katie, and welcome to everyone who's here and has joined us today for the webinar. I'm Karen Brown, and as Katie mentioned, I co-lead the university's system-wide Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, and I also direct the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, which is a campus-wide center that's also part of the GPS Alliance. So I'm really happy to see everyone here today. I'm going to introduce each one of our speakers in turn, and as has already been noted, please do place any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will be presenting those questions to the speakers during our Q&A time after they've each made their remarks. So we're going to start with our first speaker, Mary Holtz-Claus. Dr. Holtz-Claus serves as Chancellor for the University of Minnesota Crookston. In this role, she oversees all aspects. One moment, please. In this role, she oversees all aspects for students, faculty, and staff on that campus. Before she moved to Crookston, she was an academic dean of agriculture, vice president of economic development, and the co-leader for a state's outreach and extension programming. All of these positions were at large public universities on both coasts and in the Midwest. She calls herself a grower, as she has worked to help start and grow numerous value-added agriculture business, communities, and organizations throughout the world. Dr. Holtz-Claus helps students grow through expanding their perspectives and understanding with hands-on learning, simulations, case studies, and starting their own enterprises. And I've had the pleasure of working currently with Dr. Holtz-Claus on a number of exciting, innovative initiatives. I'm really pleased to have her here today, and I'm going to turn over the virtual microphone to you now, Dr. Holtz-Claus, for your remarks.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Brown, and it's exciting to be here to maybe share with you a few perspectives. Certainly the number one sustainable development goal of alleviating and ending poverty. I'm going to be talking from poverty perspective today, primarily from the U.S. perspective, and I know we have some of my other colleagues who are going to be addressing this from a more global perspective. And I do just want to kind of preface that with saying, normally I don't just think kind of what I would say from a U.S. perspective, but wanted to share with you a context right here in your own state, in the state of Minnesota. And oftentimes there's almost in Minnesota, as we know, there are 2 or 3 Minnesotas. And I'm going to talk about, as I said, primarily from the perspective of greater Minnesota or rural Minnesota. So with that, next slide, please. The first thing I'd like you to maybe kind of put behind you are some of the assumptions that perhaps you hold about rural America, and then consequently what those impacts are on rural poverty. The first thing that everybody always thinks about when they think of rural America is agriculture, or at least many people do. And particularly in this region. Now, I've worked in the coal mining regions and others, so that obviously doesn't go into ag, that rural then thinks about maybe some of the other resource and mining resources. But in rural Minnesota, that's primarily, at least my region, where people think about is agriculture. And while it is very important, and it was definitely the genesis of the founding of that region, it has become such that we have many large farms. Most of them are not corporate farms. They might be corporations, but they're family-owned farms. To the point now where I'm going to share with you anecdotally. One of my previous Midwest state where I did lots of my time was in Iowa, and my husband and I are farmers in Iowa. And I remember looking at the graduation class, the commencement class of one of my daughters, 140 kids, and I actually counted the number of parents who were farmers. There were 4 of us out of 140 in a very rural, very agricultural based. And so many of those people were involved in agriculture, and their parents were involved in agriculture. They might have been the seed sales people, they might have been the cooperative people, they might have been the bankers. But directly involved in agriculture, we're now down as a nation, down to about 2% of the total US population. 1.5% to 2% of the total US population is involved in agriculture. Obviously, rural America is agriculture because you need that land mass in order to be farmers in the traditional way that we've looked at farming, which are continue to be large areas. Another, I guess, kind of say a myth I'd like to debunk is that they're not less educated and people that work in rural communities. If you look at the census of agriculture, you're going to find out, for instance, and if you look at rural communities, there are many, many very educated individuals. Again, going back to my little hometown in Iowa, I had a number, there were 4 or 5, who went to Harvard. Almost every farmer, every agriculturist, everybody who was involved in that field had a bachelor's of science. So if you could put away that myth that they're less educated. But one thing which is very much definitely impacts rural America anymore today is that there is not an equality in broadband connectivity. Some areas are 5G and 4G. Others, it's still at the dial-up area. And that is one myth I would like you to hold on to, that there is a great inequality. And another kind of myth that often one holds about rural America, particularly, is that it is not wealthy. And again, if you look at many people, there is significant wealth. Oftentimes that wealth is not as showy as I would say it is in urban areas or the suburban areas, because that wealth is invested in the operation and into the business. And so as you look at that, you don't see the disparity that we often see in other areas. Everybody looks about the same from a socioeconomic perspective. One of the areas that I would really like to talk about is with rural America. It is very ripe with potential, and particularly since COVID, as we have discovered that if you have broadband connectivity, you can work almost anywhere. And I think that's a great opportunity for more people to look at the lifestyle that many are able to have. They're able to generally own homes. I'll talk a little bit later about employment. There's certainly many employment opportunities. I think it's a great opportunity for people to look at coming back into rural America. Very socially connected, and is becoming more diverse. Again, particularly in Minnesota, if you look at the newcomers into the rural areas, they are of populations that had not been here before. So in this region, there's a large group of Somalis who have found that Northwest Minnesota is a welcoming place for them to be. In the Crookston, the University of Minnesota is located in Crookston. Clear up, my relatives go, we scrolled, and we finally found Crookston, 90 minutes from Canada. So clear up in the Northwest, but a very diverse population in the Crookston public schools. 40% of the K-6 are children who readily identify as Latino, Latinx. And so again, we're starting to see more diversity. And we generally, historically, when I've spoken with employers across the United States, they like to hire people from rural areas because we call the MacGyver effect. These individuals oftentimes have grown up with fewer resources and are able to kind of make things from, look about what's available. And most recently, we had a conversation with 3M, and they said, we'd love to hire these students. We'd love to hire people from rural areas because of that, of the MacGyver effect, because they're looking at things holistically. They're looking at ways to be innovative and creative. And then the other myth, I guess I'd like you to, or assumption I'd like you to think about in rural America, is that there's significant interconnectivity because of social media now between rural and urban communities. And that's given, and I'm sure that my colleagues, when they speak of other of their work in other countries, are also going to speak about that. Next slide, please. So as we go forward, one of the things, though, that does become a significant issue in rural America, and it's a significant issue as it affects rural poverty, is that the unemployment rate up here, 1.5%, 2%, they don't even bother to publish it because it's so low. We just are not able to find enough workers with skill sets. But there are people that are living here who are no longer included in the employment statistics because they've given up looking. And that, so employment statistics are those that are actively seeking positions. And that particularly has been true of some of our various populations in rural America. The individuals have not been given equal access to education. There's some that are doing very well, thank you. There are some that are very, very severely affected and severely affected by poverty. And some of those, unfortunately, particularly are some of our Native American populations, which are close by to us. We have several Native nations within an hour of us. There has not been equal access and been equal opportunity. And so oftentimes those children do not have the access to that, and then ultimately an economic poverty, which comes with that, not only the economic, but food security, food issues, food availability with that. Next slide, please. So one of the areas where education provides as much opportunity to rural America as it does to urban and suburban America, we need to do a better job of sharing opportunities, and more importantly, I would say, is provided guided pathways. Oftentimes, particularly in higher education, we wait for the students to come to us. We wait until they're in junior, senior, and high school. We need to start much earlier with students. Let them see that there are ways that they can, with working with and work with their families, work with their parents, work with their grandparents, to show a different pathway. Oftentimes people are like, well, it's fine if my grandkid or kid makes it through high school, that's great because that's better than I did. And yet we know if we could take them to another level and beyond high school and into higher education, that there are many more career opportunities. Those positions are out there, just nobody to fill them right now. But in order for that to occur, it cannot be abstract. We need to be very practical and applied. A lot of the STEM programming that we do with 4-H and our other partners, we're trying to make it alive, fun, and relevant to a student. Unfortunately, I think in higher education, sometimes we spend too much time talking about theory. And with particularly rural students, it's very much a hands-on approach to that. And then also recognizing that not all things are equal. A student who goes to one of the suburban high schools has probably a much stronger education than students in rural communities. And so, for instance, at the University of Minnesota Crookston, we went test optional. We don't require the ACT. We have enough data to show if our students come to us motivated and had done relatively well in high school, GPA is more important than what their ACT and SAT scores are, because they didn't have all of the special classes and tutoring and opportunities. And likewise, a lot of our rural areas don't have access to counseling, career awareness. So that becomes really incumbent upon us to help with that and help them. We have special classes or special times for parents, special Zooms on how to do the FAFSA and so forth as we go forward at that. So, and then as I have on my comment, on my note there, all of these issues are really exacerbated by diverse citizenship, diverse cultures, different ways of looking at things. When I was at, next slide, please. When I was at California, I was meeting with the parents, and I'm talking with the parents of college-age students about the importance of internships and why we felt this was so relevant. And I just kept talking and talking, and I could see that they're not buying into this. So I went back at the end and I thought, well, maybe it's communications. I better wrap up on time here. But so I read back and I spoke to them in Spanish, and they looked at me and they go, no, you don't understand. We don't want particularly our daughters to leave and have internships. It's not okay. And so part of that is being culturally aware of doing that. And I'll let you read my slides there. I have one more slide, and I'll wrap it up here and go on to our next speaker here. So the important part is that together, I think that we have many opportunities designing a future of rural together. And these are some of the things that we have ongoing right now with Katie and Karen and others, to be able to change some of those ways that we can address the issue of poverty. As we all know, there's those many wealth or intellectual, natural, cultural, political. And most important ones, I think, are individual and social. How do we create a greater human capacity so that there are opportunities in rural areas? Thank you so much. On to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holtz-Claus. I'm having a little echo. Oh, there, it's gone now. Great. I'm really appreciative of your remarks, Dr. Holtz-Claus. Thank you so much. And now we will transition to our next speaker, Amanda Lyons. Amanda is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. Working at the nexus of human rights and development, her teaching, research, and advocacy focuses on human rights-based approaches to economic, environmental, and gender justice. Before joining the university, Amanda worked with an advocacy network to advance human rights protections in the negotiation of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. With partners, she has authored several training and advocacy guides on water, fracking, poverty, and SDG monitoring. Most recently, she has published on water, rights, and poverty in the context of the SDGs, and the SDGs as a guide for COVID-19 recovery efforts, and co-edited a new research handbook on human rights and poverty with Martha F. Davis and Morton Karam. Amanda is a proud graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School, and we are really delighted to have her here today with us to share her thoughts. Amanda, I'll turn the podium over to you now.
Thanks so much, Karen. And even just listening to that, you can tell I think I can get a little obsessed about the SDGs. It's really exciting to get to be part of this conversation, and I love to hear about the initiative. I'm really proud that here at the university we have such a robust engagement. So I appreciate your and Katie's leadership on that. So today I'm just going to look at the time here. Today, I want to speak about the connections between poverty and human rights and what those linkages could mean for how we understand the SDGs, and what especially kind of insights or elements that are coming from the human rights field could be brought into the SDG engagement to enrich it. And before I do that, I just want to make the clarification that what I see with the SDGs that's really fascinating is, on the one hand, we have a very formal engagement centralized at the UN of nation states and international actors kind of working on the agenda at this multilateral level and this formal process. And there's definitely a lot of exciting work to be done on the connection with human rights at that setting. But what's just as exciting, I think, is all the kind of decentralized SDG efforts, like the one that we're doing right now, of people kind of taking the SDG agenda as their own and running with it in all these different contexts. And so especially today, I'm interested to think about what from the human rights field could come into those less centralized spaces where there's actually more flexibility to decide what the metrics are, what the processes are, who can be participating. So my main goal is that, to see what the human rights framework could bring into our work in the SDGs. And let me see the notes. try to speak closer to the microphone. Hopefully that will help with the audio. So today I'm going to try to cover quickly 4 elements from the human rights framework, and then I'll just go over those broadly, and then if there's specific issues that are interesting for the attendees or the other panelists, I'd love to go in further. So the first point I want to make is the human rights-based definition of poverty, how we understand what poverty is. And kind of over the decades that the human rights system has been thinking about poverty, 2 important evolutions have happened. First, thinking about poverty as a multidimensional human condition. So not just income poverty, but thinking about all the different ways that poverty is connected to other human rights like health, housing, food, water, social security. So this multidimensional experience of poverty, which I know is also common in the development sphere. And secondly, and more recently, the human rights field has really engaged in thinking about poverty as a process of exclusion. So not as a static condition, but actually the process of material deprivations happening on top of being excluded and marginalized from society. There's a really interesting report that has been really influential called The Hidden Dimensions of Poverty that was done by ATD, Fourth World, and Oxford University. It's really influenced how the human rights system is engaging with poverty. And it's interesting, I think they capture what Dr. Holtz-Claus was mentioning about the MacGyver effect. One of the dimensions that came out of their research was the experience of unrecognized contribution. So all of the resilience, intelligence, innovations that come from people that have to live in poverty, all of their kind of ingenuity that comes out of that are not recognized by society. So I will just kind of throw that out there for those of you that are tracking poverty in the context of SDGs, that you can look to human rights materials to come up with more information about the different dimensions that we could look at if we're tracking poverty. The actual SDG targets, the first 2 are really focused to income level, one on the international poverty level, and the second one related to national policy poverty lines. But the SDG agenda itself, you can see in the name, it says end poverty in all its forms. And so it's really speaking to this multidimensional experience of poverty. Then the second point that I wanted to make about human rights is, I think especially in the United States, we think about human rights as civil and political rights, often kind of negative restraints on the state. So limits on the state in terms of violations of our civil rights. And since the beginning of the development of human rights law, human rights has been much more robust than that view. And human rights actually includes a lot of normative content related to economic, social, cultural rights that obviously have a special urgency when we're thinking about the rights of people living in poverty. So whether it is water, housing, food, all kinds of social security, healthcare, in the human rights system, there's very clear indicators of what is access to water in line with human dignity, according to the human rights system. And I find that for communities that are trying to gauge these questions, kind of taking the indicators from the human rights field can be a useful way to flesh out what water can mean for communities living in poverty. For example, some of the indicators are, does seeking access to water prejudice other rights? So is it so costly that you can't afford other needs? Are you exposing yourself to violence to get water? These different dimensions. Is the water available kind of culturally appropriate? Is it safe? Is it reliable? So I just throw that out there, that there's this wealth of information, kind of substantive rights that relate to the experience of poverty that the human rights frame offers. The SDG targets, you know, when you look at how they have the indicators, they connect the goal on poverty to other goals on water, on gender, and the human rights framework kind of maps onto that. So a big thrust of the SDGs and what makes them kind of, what gives them their transformative potential is this integrated look. So not kind of taking a piecemeal approach to the goals, but thinking about how do we eradicate poverty while not prejudicing other aims like environmental sustainability or access to justice. And so the human rights framework and the thinking that's been developed over decades on economic, social, cultural rights brings a lot of elements for communities and activists to think about what that could mean. And maybe the last point on that is, and this is a shift we see from the Millennial Development Goals to the now Sustainable Development Goals that we have, is the focus really on the SDG is almost entirely on universality, on kind of ending extreme poverty, that target 1.1 for everybody with no exception. And that's consistent with a human rights-based approach. If every human has the rights, we can't kind of accept a halfway progress point. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the universality. And what that element from the human rights frame kind of brings for our own reflection on how we look at the SDGs is a call to look for what people have called the invisible poor or the missing poor. So not being satisfied at numbers that only count on a sample that involves people that are already accessing social services, and then miss all the people that are so excluded for the many different obstacles that they're not part of that world. And so proactively seeking out and thinking about if our efforts under the SDG banner are reaching these invisible poor. And I thought an example of that from Dr. Holtzclaw's description is those that have already fallen off the unemployment record, for example, how easily those can move into kind of invisible poor that then aren't captured. And the human rights lens really pushes us to think about who those people could be and to bring them into the fold of the discussion. So without wanting to extend on my time, I'll say quickly, the next point is that comes from the human rights frame is a first do no harm approach. And so being cautious of thinking about SDG 1 or any of the other goals only in terms of positive contributions, of seeking to make advances under particular indicators without simultaneously looking at potential harms. So kind of where those same or other indicators could be undermined. And the example that comes up really clearly for me is a case that we're working on at the Human Rights Center. I see Veronica's online, another researcher working on the project, is the case of El Quimbo, which is a hydroelectric dam that was installed over opposition from the community and has had manifold impact on the affected community. And they would allege not any fulfillment on some of the promises for development in the local community that was promised. And so I would refer to this as kind of development inflicted poverty. And what we see is hydropower being kind of showcased in the Colombian National Report on their SDG contributions. And so you can see there can be these paradoxes in terms of harms or kind of undermining of SDG indicators that's coming from initiatives that are being promoted under the same agenda. And a robust human rights lens that looks at the SDGs as a whole would help catch some of those paradoxes. And last, maybe the kind of most powerful or notable contribution from a human rights-based approach is the focus on people as rights holders who are empowered to participate and claim their rights and design policies that affect them, and importantly, hold duty bearers accountable. And so this rights duty dimension of thinking about poverty in a human rights lens kind of forces us to think about in context of poverty or deprivation, who are the actors that have responsibility and against whom can the rights be claimed? And thinking about pulling those actors into the conversation about SDG. And it's really exciting and important and necessary to have multi-stakeholder conversations, and at the same time not lose, especially the state in its role as guarantor of human rights. So not only to kind of advance these economic and social rights that are important for people living in poverty, but also respect and protect from intervention by third parties, especially corporate actors, kind of human rights violations that would impact people. And so it's really, in a lot of cases, missing in SDG initiatives. It's a very aspirational, cooperative mobilization, and not so clear how to hold actors that are subscribing and kind of taking up the SDG banner. How do we hold them accountable for kind of committing to the whole agenda and not just the pieces that maybe are the most interesting to them? And before I sign off, we'll just say with Stephanie and Veronica, who are listening in, we're starting a new project where we're especially looking at cities and universities as really exciting sites of kind of taking the SDGs out of that international context and translating it and adapting it to do work at this local level. And we're excited to see how human rights components could make those processes really participatory and democratically responsive, and hopefully really effective in terms of addressing inequality. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to the discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your wonderful remarks. It's great to hear about the work that you're doing in this area. And I'm now going to introduce our third presenter. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Raghi Assad. Professor Assad researches education, labor policy, and labor market analysis in developing countries with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. His current work focuses on inequality of opportunity in education, labor markets, transitions from school to work, employment and unemployment dynamics, family formation, informality, labor market responses to economic shocks, international migration, including the effects of forced migration. He is a research fellow of the Economic Research Forum in Cairo, Egypt, and serves on its board of trustees. He is also a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. Dr. Assad served as regional director for West Asia and North Africa for the Population Council based in Cairo, Egypt from 2005 to 2008. And he has also served as a consultant to the World Bank, International Labor Organization, Ford Foundation, UNICEF, and UNDP. And Professor Assad is a professor in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs here at the University of Minnesota, and a colleague I've had the pleasure to work on many projects with. I'm delighted to have you here to share your perspectives today, and I'll turn the microphone over to you now, Raghi.
Thank you very much, Karen. I really appreciate the invitation. And I will be, if you could permit me to share my screen, that would be great. Thank you. So I am actually speaking to you today from Khartoum, Sudan, and it's somewhat fitting that I'm in one of the world's low-income countries that has really been torn by conflict, unrest, economic sanctions, and is after a period of overthrowing their dictator and reorganizing democratizing government, is really emerging in the community of nations and trying to improve the lot of its people. So it's wonderful to be here. But of course, the risk of being in a poor country is that the internet is somewhat unstable, and you might lose me at some point. But hopefully it will be resilient for the time that I'm on. So I want to talk about this SDG-1 from a Global South perspective, from the perspective of kind of looking at how poverty has been addressed in the development field over the years, which is the field that I associate myself with. And there's been great concern. This has been the most important concern since the 19th century, really, with an evolving vocabulary about how we speak about poverty. First, we had the talk about relief and how we needed to have relief from poverty. Poverty was kind of always with us, but we could have relief. And then the term poverty alleviation came into vogue, which also was reducing, or somewhat reducing the impact of poverty. And then the discussion of poverty reduction language came into vogue. And then you can see a bit of a change in the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, where we're talking about eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. which was the goal 1 under the Millennium Development Goals. And then finally, the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So a much more ambitious agenda than what came before it. So how well are we doing on this agenda? And I'm going to show you some measures of poverty. So before I actually show you the measures, I want to discuss the various measures that are out there. We have, as Amanda said, some income consumption-based measures of poverty, which are very commonly used in international comparisons. They are fairly easy to apply. They use what is called PPP dollars. PPP stands for purchasing power parity. So they kind of take this, convert into this currency that has equal purchasing power in different countries. And it sets 2 different levels: extreme poverty, which is $1.9 per person per day in the purchasing power parity dollar of 2011. So it's kind of what the PPP dollar was purchasing in 2011, and that's one international poverty line that is used to do international comparison. And then regular poverty is now set at $3.2 per person per day in this 2011 PPP dollar. So the PPP dollar does a fairly good job at equalizing what the dollar can purchase in various parts of the world. So of course, it's not the regular exchange rate that is used, but an exchange rate that reflects that the dollar can go much further in poorer countries than it does in richer countries. Now, so those are used for international comparisons, and a number of the comparisons I'll show you next are based on these international measures. There's also a national poverty measure where you have each country setting its own poverty line, again, based on income or consumption. Those poverty lines reflect much more local conditions in terms of what sort of purchases people can have in terms of minimum food needs and other non-food needs. But still ones where income and consumption are the main metric of poverty. Now, as Amanda said, the development community is moving a lot more towards a multidimensional poverty measure. And it is an emerging way of measuring poverty. Increasingly, the methodology is getting much more formalized and much more agreed upon across nations. It's been adopted by the UNDP and the UN Human Development Report. It really is looks at dimensions of material well-being, so it does include income and the material side of consumption, but also education, health and nutrition, housing, and some of the other dimensions Amanda mentioned, access to water, etc. Now, it's been implemented in many countries. There is still some controversy over what the poverty lines are for each of these dimensions, what is considered to be the line of deprivation. And there's also some controversy over how much weight you give to each of these dimensions. So it hasn't been implemented across the board to have global measures of poverty using this multidimensional poverty, but it is increasingly being used as a very important way of looking at poverty in a more comprehensive way than the income measures. So let's actually look at how we've been doing in terms of reducing extreme poverty first and across the world. So the thick green line is the percent of people below this 1.90 per person per day poverty line. And you can see that it's been falling quite steadily since the early 1980s, from 40% to approximately 10% now, and before COVID. So this is prior to COVID. And you can see that most regions of the world, there's been a strong, somewhat downward trend, with East Asia and Pacific having the most steep downward trend, where almost you could say that in the East Asian Pacific, extreme poverty has been eradicated. So Latin America as well, very low levels. In the Middle East and North Africa, extreme poverty was low to start with, has been declining, but starting 2011, it's been going up again. And this is due to the conflicts that emerged in the post so-called Arab Spring period, especially in Syria and Yemen. And conflict, as we will see, is one of the biggest predictor of poverty. So that there's a very strong connection between the presence of conflict and extreme poverty. And so you can see this kind of upward trend starting again in the Middle East and North Africa. But the biggest concern is in sub-Saharan Africa, where extreme poverty rates are still very high, and that they are not declining as fast as we would like. So they are declining, but still much more slowly. South Asia, there's been slow decline at first, but since 2005, the decline has been much faster. So we have been making progress, but in certain parts of the world, the progress has been slow, and in other parts it has reversed. Now, if we actually look at the other poverty line of $3.2 per person per day, the progress there is a little bit even more iffy in terms of Africa and South Asia. You can see that the rates are still very high when you use that poverty line in these two regions. And in Africa, it's almost flat, declining very, very slowly. So, and you can see again, the big upward shift in the Middle East post-2011. Again, East Asia, China in particular, is where the rates have been declining quite substantially. So very uneven progress around the world, with even prior to COVID, things improving, but not as fast as we would like, at least in some parts of the world. Now, what about the number of people? So this is the number of people who are extremely poor, and not the proportion of people. And you can see that that number globally has been declining from about 1.9 billion in the early 1990s to about 700 million or so in 2017. And that is primarily because of that decline in East Asia and the Pacific. And that's China plays a very big role there. But you can see South Asia also, the number has declined quite substantially in more recent years. And of course, Latin America, the number of poor is small to start with, but has been declining. And in Middle East and North Africa, you can't see it here, but the number has been increasing in recent years. But it's a very small number, so it doesn't show very much. But the really bad news is that the number of extreme poor in Africa has been rising. Despite the slow decline in the proportion of people who are extremely poor, the number of extreme poor in Africa has been going up, and it's actually increased from about 300 million to over 400 million over the period that we're looking at here. So what's been going on this past year? COVID-19 has been a huge setback to the poverty reduction efforts, as we all know. But let me kind of put that in context. It's been the first increase in global poverty rates in decades. So we have had, as you could see, a steady decline in global poverty rates overall, but this has been the first time that global poverty rates have increased in many decades. The setbacks are not only due to COVID-19, but there's been, prior to that, conflict and climate change have been slowing down the decline to the point where in some regions, in fact, conflict has increased the number of extreme poor quite substantially, as we saw for the Middle East and North Africa. Now, 71 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty just in 2020. And this is the largest increase since the World Bank started tracking this data in the 1970s and 80s. Now, the most affected groups all over the world are what you can imagine, groups of casual wage workers, irregular wage workers that depend on kind of getting work every day and not being able to find it in many days because of the slowdown of the economies during COVID, but small farmers and small self-employed individuals. I don't like to call them entrepreneurs. Most of them are not really entrepreneurs. They are in survival, self-employment work, and many of those have been affected. So we've seen study after study of the effects of COVID-19 showing that these groups and who are the ones who are most vulnerable to poverty to start with, being most affected by the closures and the economic slowdown during COVID-19. And that's exacerbates the inequalities and the poverty. So prior to COVID, as I mentioned earlier, the highest risk of extreme poverty is in conflict-affected countries. And in fact, 40% of the extreme poor live in conflict-affected countries. So conflict is really a huge cause of extreme poverty. And unless we deal with conflict and its aftermath, we're not going to be able to reach the goal of eradicating extreme poverty that Amanda talked about. So now climate change is another very important long-term risk. And in fact, it's a risk that is increasing to some extent. World Bank estimates are that between 68 and 135 million people will be driven into poverty by 2030 due to climate change. So that it is poor countries tend to be affected much more by climate change, and it's going to drive a lot of people unless we do something to mitigate the climate risk. Now, so how do we, given this situation, how do we move towards the goal of poverty eradication? And this is where, first there are layers of strategies. The first one is that the pattern of growth has to be pro-poor, that you cannot have growth that leaves a whole bunch of people behind. And so it has to be a pattern of growth that makes use of the human and physical assets of the poor intensively. It has to be employment-intensive growth, and one that is not skewed towards skilled workers, educated workers, but towards the poor and the unskilled labor that the poor often provide. And so it needs to be a pattern of growth that is producing decent work through employment-intensive growth. And what we've seen in many countries, that the pattern of growth has favored skill-intensive jobs, ones that the poor really cannot occupy or take, or jobless growth. Growth where most of the growth is going to the top 1-2% of the population who don't actually make money through labor, but make money through profit on capital, etc. So we have had kind of immiserizing patterns of growth in many contexts. Now, so that's really has to be the primary mechanism for lifting people out of poverty, is the pattern of employment that is generated from economic growth to lift people out of poverty. Now, the second issue, as I mentioned, there's going to have to be a focus on conflict prevention and protection against climate-induced shocks. These are two huge risks, and you can just think of the situation of Syria and Yemen in the last few years to see how quickly people can be pushed into abject poverty as a result of conflict. Now, of course, the third line of attack is instituting social safety nets that protect people against shocks and support the poorest. And these should be a sort of human right to entitle people to a minimum standard of living, as Amanda said, that is guaranteed, especially if you're hit by shocks. And as we see, many countries have introduced these social safety nets during the COVID crisis, and in fact have found that they do work in many cases. They haven't been, the coverage hasn't been widespread enough, hasn't covered all the people who need this kind of social support, but many countries have introduced cash transfer programs for informal workers, for the poorest households. in order to protect them against the shock of that COVID provided. However, many of these programs, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need a couple of minutes for Q&A. Could I ask you to wrap up your last point, please?
The very last point is that we have learned a great deal in recent years about programs that target the ultra poor and that help graduate them from poverty. And these are often called asset-based programs, which are supported by a bunch of other interventions to allow the ultra poor to graduate from poverty. And I've been involved in evaluating some of these programs, and they have really proven very effective across many different contexts in the world. So that this set of layered strategies can actually help us move towards poverty eradication. And thank you, and sorry for talking too long.
Thank you very much, Professor Assad. And thank you to all of our speakers for a really wonderful set of presentations. We only have a few short moments, and we have one question in the Q&A, and then I have one more general question. There's a specific question concerning, I think this was directed to Dr. Holtz-Claus. And that was about the sentiment of white Americans toward immigrant farmers in rural areas. So thinking about, I presume, barriers to poverty eradication for immigrant farmers. Do you want to comment briefly on that?
I will comment. I guess I don't have any data in front of me, but one of the things which I often see with the farmers themselves is they're very interested, they're very supportive, they do a lot of visa immigration support because they need workers from various backgrounds to come help them. But oftentimes, even though the employer might be interested, the community itself, as we know, is not always very welcoming and integrating to the various groups who come. Therefore, I think it's our role, and I see this a lot with Extension and others, is to help people understand how to welcome individuals to your communities. And I know University of Minnesota, the Rural Vitality groups and others really work at that and help. Ben Winchester is particularly an individual who does a really good job of outlining how you think you're being nice, you're being Minnesota nice, but really how you're responding to this does not really provide a welcoming and inclusive environment. So,
okay. Thank you very much. A related question that I'll toss out to both Amanda and Raghi, perhaps for a few last closing thoughts, since we only have a couple of minutes here. And there's a question about the intersection between poverty and racism in the chat. And I think that's an important one. If you could say a little more about that, and also perhaps poverty and gender. I know, Raghi, you talked a lot about the impacts of COVID, but we know in the United States, one of the significant impacts of COVID, and I presume globally, is women's unemployment increasing at a disproportionate level. So racism and poverty, gender and poverty, how is this intersectional, these intersectional issues affecting poverty rates? And maybe if Amanda could say something briefly, and Raghi, that would be great.
Sure, that's a great question. And I think something that's helpful thinking about poverty in terms of process and a history, a legacy of human rights violations, is it helps to see the question of poverty not as an issue of only charity or humanitarianism, but of justice, of kind of making structural changes and remedying past harms as a way to eradicate poverty, and not treating poverty as something isolated from these structural facets. And nothing shows that more than racism, except also maybe sexism. So, great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I talked about conflict-induced poverty in the global South, a lot of that conflict is actually national conflict within countries, and it is based on ethnic, essentially exclusion of groups, and that results often in ethnic conflict and attempts at sometimes ethnic cleansing and other. So race or ethnicity is really very strongly built into the exclusions that lead to the conflict and the poverty that results from it. Now, on the gender issue, I think, Karen, you're absolutely right. It's not just that women become unemployed, but women get pushed out of the labor force altogether, as Mary said, that in fact, all over the world, we see labor force participation on the part of women plummeted this last year because they had to assume most of the care burden with COVID. And so I think one has to look beyond the unemployment statistics, which don't capture women who exit the labor force altogether. And I think that that's a huge impact on household budgets and ability for and increases poverty quite substantially.
Great. Thank you for those responses. We're actually just a minute over our time. So I think we're going to have to wrap up. Unfortunately, there are so many more questions we could discuss. I think you've given us a great deal of food for thought. And I'm so happy to hear all of your perspectives from rural Minnesota communities to the global context, and to see both the possibilities as well as the challenges with addressing the SDG 1. So thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of our audience participants. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question. I appreciate your being here today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar at the beginning of the academic year. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.